There's a gentleman here asking for you." Emma did not even look up from her screen. Another meeting request. Another contract waiting for her signature. Another ordinary Tuesday in a life built entirely out of ordinary days. "Tell him to schedule an appointment," she said. Her assistant lingered in the doorway, smiling in a way Emma had never seen before. "He says he already has one. He's had it scheduled for 28 years. Those words stopped her cold. Emma had spent 2 decades inside courtrooms and boardrooms, trained never to be surprised by anything a person could say. But this sentence reached somewhere far older than her career, somewhere she had buried beneath spreadsheets and case files and birthdays that came and went without anyone to celebrate them with. Slowly, she lifted her eyes toward the door. And there he was, taller than she remembered, steadier. The boy who used to climb the oak tree behind their school had become a man standing quietly in her office, holding something small and yellowed between his fingers. A single piece of notebook paper. Folded so many times the creases had turned soft and white. Emma knew exactly what it was before he even spoke a word, because she had written half of it herself, 28 years earlier, sitting beneath that same oak tree, certain she was making a promise that would never actually matter. She had been wrong. And by the end of that single afternoon, everything she believed about love, about timing, about the life she had built so carefully without him, was about to be tested in ways she never saw coming. 28 years earlier, none of it had felt important at all. Emma was 12 years old, sitting cross-legged in the grass with her best friend Daniel, the two of them sharing a bag of chips after the last bell of the school day. The oak tree behind their elementary school had been their meeting spot since the 3rd grade, the kind of place children claim as their own without ever asking permission from anyone. Daniel was the one who brought it up, the way he brought up most things, half joking and half serious at the same time. "What if neither of us gets married? Like, what if we get old and nobody wants us?" Emma laughed so hard she nearly choked on a chip. "Nobody is not going to want you, Daniel. You don't know that. What if we're both, like, 40 and totally alone?" To a 12-year-old, 40 sounded like a different planet, an age so distant it barely felt real, attached to parents and teachers and people who drove minivans. "Fine," Emma said, still laughing. "If we're both 40 and neither of us is married, we'll just marry each other." Daniel grinned and held out his hand. "Promise?" "Promise." They shook on it the way children seal every important agreement, with complete seriousness and zero understanding of what the years ahead would actually hold. Then Daniel tore a sheet from his notebook, and together they wrote it out properly, because somehow a spoken promise had not felt official enough. "If neither of us is married by the time we turn 40, we will marry each other." They signed their names beneath it. Emma added a small heart beside hers, the kind every 12-year-old girl drew without thinking. Daniel folded the paper into a careful square and slid it into his pocket like it was something valuable. Neither of them ever imagined keeping it. It was a joke, a silly, sweet, harmless joke between two kids who had no idea what loneliness even felt like yet. But somewhere underneath the laughter, a single sentence had quietly planted itself in both of their minds, waiting 28 years to be remembered. Daniel's family moved away less than a year later, transferred to another state for his father's job. There was no dramatic goodbye, no tearful scene at an airport, just a quiet conversation in the school hallway, a promise to write letters that both of them meant completely, and neither of them kept past a few months. Childhood has its own mercy that way. It lets you grieve something fully for exactly as long as you need to, and then it gently moves you forward into the next thing. For Emma, the next thing was middle school, then high school, then the slow accumulation of a life entirely her own. She buried herself in classes and competitions, discovering early that she had a mind built for arguments, for finding the gap in someone else's logic before they even noticed it themselves. Law school felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. She moved to Chicago for an internship that turned into a job offer, and the job offer turned into a career that consumed nearly everything else in her life, in the best and worst ways possible. She built a reputation as someone who never lost an argument she had time to prepare for. Partners trusted her with the cases nobody else wanted to touch. Clients requested her by name. What she did not build, no matter how hard she tried, was the kind of steady, simple companionship she used to take for granted, as a child sitting under a tree with her best friend. Relationships came into her life in waves. A law school boyfriend who could not handle her hours. A long-distance attempt with a man in New York that quietly dissolved somewhere over a holiday neither of them flew home for. A serious relationship in her early 30s that ended the week she made partner, when he told her, almost gently, that he had been waiting for her to choose him over her career and had finally accepted she never would. She told herself she did not need it. She told herself often enough that some days she almost believed it. Daniel's path took a different shape entirely. He studied architecture, chasing a fascination with old buildings that had started, although neither of them ever realized it at the time, with a single oak tree he used to climb as a boy. He worked his way through smaller firms in smaller cities, restoring old houses, rebuilding train stations, slowly developing a name for himself among people who cared about buildings with history. He had relationships too, some serious. One engagement that ended 8 months before the wedding, for reasons he rarely spoke about and never fully explained even to himself. Through all of it, on both sides of all those years, neither of them spoke about a piece of paper folded into a square. Neither of them allowed themselves to think about an oak tree or a promise made by 2 children who believed 40 was an age that belonged to other people. Until, quietly, without either of them planning for it, 40 stopped being a number that belonged to other people. By the time Emma's 40th birthday approached, she had built precisely the life she once thought she wanted. Her office sat on the 31st floor of a building downtown, with a view of the lake that clients often commented on more than they commented on her legal advice. Her name appeared on the firm's letterhead, in a font slightly larger than the associates beneath her. She had savings, investments, a condo she owned outright, and a closet full of the kind of clothes that quietly announced success without needing to say anything at all. She had everything people were supposed to admire. What she did not have was anyone to come home to. Her birthday fell on a Tuesday that year. She marked it the way she marked most milestones lately, with a quiet dinner alone and a phone call from her mother that lasted exactly long enough to ask, gently and predictably, whether there was anyone special in her life yet. There was not. There had not been, not really, for almost 3 years. Emma had stopped describing herself as someone who simply had not found the right person yet. Somewhere around 38, she had quietly stopped believing the right person was still out there waiting to be found. It felt less like giving up and more like growing up, accepting a version of her future that did not include a partner the way the version in her childhood imagination once had. She still believed in love. She simply no longer believed it was coming for her specifically. So when her birthday passed without ceremony, she did what she always did. She went back to work the next morning, opened her laptop, and let the noise of deadlines fill the space where something else used to live in her imagination. She had no idea that a single folded piece of paper, carried across the country by a man she had not seen in nearly 3 decades, was already on its way toward changing all of that. For a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. Emma stood slowly behind her desk, the contract she had been reviewing completely forgotten. Daniel stayed in the doorway, the folded paper still resting in his fingers, like something he had carried so long it had become part of his hand. He looked older in all the ways that suited him. The boyish softness she remembered had settled into something steadier, more deliberate, but his eyes were exactly the same warm brown, the same way of looking at her like she was the only person in the room worth paying attention to. "Daniel," she said, and his name felt strange in her mouth after so many years of not saying it. He smiled, the same smile she remembered from childhood, only deeper now, carved into the lines around his eyes. I figured I should keep my appointment. Emma laughed before she even decided to. It came out shaky, somewhere between disbelief and the sudden, overwhelming urge to cry, although she could not have explained why. "You kept the paper," she said. "You're surprised? I'm shocked you didn't lose it within a year." "I almost did. Twice." He stepped further into the office, glancing briefly at the view behind her desk before bringing his attention back to her. "It's been in a box in every apartment I've ever lived in. I used to tell myself I kept it because it was funny, a reminder of how dramatic we used to be as kids. And now?" He held her gaze a moment longer than felt comfortable, or perhaps exactly as long as it needed to. "Now, I think I kept it, because some part of me never stopped wondering." Emma's assistant quietly closed the door, leaving the two of them alone with 28 years of silence finally beginning to speak. They talked for nearly 2 hours that afternoon, Emma's schedule abandoned without a second thought, something that had not happened in all her years at the firm. They filled in the gaps, the moves, the careers, the relationships that had not worked, the parents who had aged, the version of themselves each had built without the other watching. It should have felt strange, picking up a friendship across nearly 3 decades of silence. Instead, it felt disturbingly easy, like resuming a conversation interrupted only a few minutes earlier rather than a lifetime ago. Neither of them mentioned the promise itself again that day. They did not need to. It was sitting on the corner of Emma's desk for the rest of the afternoon, folded and quiet, watching everything unfold exactly the way it once predicted it might. What started as a single afternoon turned into a pattern neither of them planned, but both of them protected fiercely. Coffee on Thursday became dinner on Saturday. Dinner on Saturday became a standing arrangement. Neither of them said out loud, the unspoken assumption that of course they would see each other again. Of course there would be a next time. Daniel had returned to Chicago to oversee the restoration of an old theater downtown, a project expected to last several months. He had spent his career chasing buildings other people had written off, finding ways to save what everyone else assumed was beyond repair. There was something almost poetic about it, although Emma kept that observation to herself for longer than she probably should have. They walked along the lake some evenings, the kind of long, meandering walks that had no destination and no need for one. Conversations that started about work somehow always ended up somewhere more personal, more honest than either of them had been with anyone in years. Daniel asked about her cases, genuinely curious, in a way most people in her life had stopped being once they realized how complicated her explanations could get. Emma asked about his buildings, surprising herself with how much she wanted to understand the difference between restoration and renovation, why some structures deserved to be saved and others did not. It felt strangely effortless, as if the 28 years between them had simply folded in on themselves, the way the old paper had folded into a square small enough to fit in a pocket. Yet beneath the easy conversation, both of them carried weight from the years apart. Emma noticed herself pulling back at moments she could not always explain, a flicker of fear whenever a conversation drifted toward anything resembling real vulnerability. She had built careful walls over the years, not out of bitterness, but out of self-protection, learning slowly that hope had a way of costing more than it gave back. Daniel carried his own weight too, although he wore it more quietly. There were nights he grew distant mid-conversation, his mind clearly somewhere in the past, in a relationship that had ended just short of a wedding, in choices he wished he had made differently when he was younger, and certain he had unlimited time to fix his mistakes later. Neither of them spoke directly about what was happening between them. It felt too large, too fragile, too easily broken by naming it before it was ready. But anyone watching from the outside would have seen it immediately. The way Daniel's entire posture softened the moment Emma walked into a room. The way Emma had started smiling at her phone in a manner her assistant noticed, but wisely never mentioned out loud. The way both of them found small reasons to extend every evening another 20 minutes, then another, neither willing to be the one who said it was time to go home. Old feelings, the kind neither of them had fully understood as children sitting beneath an oak tree, began quietly resurfacing. Not the simple, uncomplicated affection of two 12-year-olds making a silly promise, but something deeper, shaped by everything both of them had lived through in the years since. For the first time in longer than Emma could honestly remember, she found herself hoping again. And hope, she was slowly relearning, was a far more dangerous thing to feel than she had allowed herself to believe. It was a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks into their reconnection, when the past finally surfaced out loud instead of staying buried beneath careful conversation. They were sitting on a bench near the water, the city lights beginning to flicker on behind them, when Daniel asked her plainly why she had never married. Emma considered deflecting the way she usually did, turning the question into a joke about difficult lawyers and impossible schedules. Instead, for reasons she could not entirely explain, she told him the truth. "I think I got scared of being chosen second," she said. "Every relationship I had, eventually it became clear my career came first to me, and that was never going to change. So either they left, or I did, before they could leave first." Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching the water. "I think I did something similar," he admitted. "Except, mine was different. I kept choosing people I knew weren't quite right, because it felt safer than waiting for something that actually mattered, and having it disappear too." "Is that what happened with your engagement?" He nodded slowly. "I think some part of me knew, even before the wedding planning started, that we weren't right for each other. But ending it felt like admitting I had wasted years, so I let it go further than I should have, until she was the one brave enough to end it instead." Emma reached over without entirely deciding to, and took his hand. "We're a mess," she said quietly. Daniel laughed, low and real. "Spectacular mess. Beneath an oak tree, 2 children somehow predicted exactly how complicated we'd both turn out to be. They predicted we'd find each other again too." Emma did not answer that directly. She simply let her hand stay where it was, watching the light stretch across the water, allowing herself, just for a moment, to imagine a version of her future that included someone else standing beside her. It was the first time in years she had let herself imagine that far ahead. It would also, she did not yet know, turn out to be the easiest part of everything still ahead of them. The difficult news arrived on an ordinary Thursday, the kind of day that gave no warning of how much it was about to change. Daniel met her for dinner, looking distracted in a way Emma had not seen since the early days of their reconnection. He waited until they had ordered, before finally explaining. The theater restoration was ahead of schedule. His firm's final inspection had been moved up, which meant his time in Chicago was ending within weeks instead of months. That alone might have been manageable. What followed was harder to absorb. His firm had already lined up his next project, an ambitious restoration of historic buildings overseas, a contract expected to keep him abroad for at least 3 years, possibly longer. Emma sat very still, processing the math without wanting to. Weeks, not months. Years, not weeks. "When did you find out?" she asked. "Yesterday." He reached for her hand across the table. "I wanted to tell you immediately. I just didn't know how." Neither of them said much else that night. The conversation that usually flowed so easily between them turned careful, almost formal. both of them suddenly aware of how much unspoken weight had settled over the table. The timing felt almost cruel in its precision. 28 years of distance, followed by mere weeks of closeness, followed by an ocean about to separate them again, possibly for longer than the time they had just spent finding each other. Emma walked home alone that night instead of letting Daniel accompany her, telling him gently that she needed time to think. What she did not say, what she barely allowed herself to admit even internally, was that she was terrified. Not of losing Daniel exactly. Terrified of choosing to hope again, only to lose in the end anyway. In the days that followed, something shifted between them, quiet and almost imperceptible at first. Calls that used to happen every evening became less frequent. Plans that once felt automatic now required actual scheduling, the kind of careful, deliberate arrangement two strangers might use rather than two people who had spent weeks falling back into each other's lives. Neither of them said the words out loud, but both understood exactly what was happening. They were protecting themselves in advance, pulling back from something that was about to hurt regardless of how carefully either of them handled it. It was easier, in some strange way, to let the closeness fade gradually than to feel its full absence all at once after Daniel's flight finally left. Emma told herself this was wisdom. She told herself she was simply being practical, sparing them both unnecessary pain over a relationship with an expiration date already written into it. Daniel, for his part, buried himself in final preparations for his departure, packing boxes, finishing paperwork, filling his days so completely there was little room left to sit still with what he actually felt. It was, in its own quiet way, exactly the same mistake both of them had made before, years earlier, with other people in other cities. Choosing distance before distance could choose them first. Choosing the smaller, more manageable hurt of pulling away early over the larger, less predictable risk of staying close until the very end. Neither of them had a piece of paper this time, reminding them what they had promised each other once. But somewhere, in the back of both their minds, the oak tree was still waiting. The night before Daniel's flight, Emma sat alone in her apartment with the lights low and the old promise spread open on the coffee table in front of her. The paper had grown so soft over the decades, it barely felt like paper anymore. More like fabric, worn thin by 28 years of folding and unfolding. The ink had faded to a pale gray in places, but the words remained perfectly legible, along with both their signatures and the small, uneven heart she had drawn beside her own name as a child. She read it slowly, the way she might read an old letter from someone who had passed away, searching it for meaning she might have missed the first dozen times. If neither of us is married by the time we turn 40, we will marry each other. It had always read, on the surface, like a backup plan, a safety net for two children terrified of growing old alone. That was how Emma had understood it for nearly 3 decades, whenever she let herself think about it at all. Sitting there that night, she finally understood it differently. The promise had never really been about marriage specifically. It had never truly been about avoiding loneliness or settling for whoever happened to still be available at 40. It had been about choosing each other, about showing up fully, even when showing up felt frightening or inconvenient or poorly timed. About refusing to let fear make the final decision, the way fear had quietly made so many decisions for both of them over the years that followed. Daniel had shown up. He had carried a piece of notebook paper across nearly 3 decades and an entire country, walked into her office, and chosen her in the most direct, unmistakable way a person could choose someone else. And Emma, faced with the exact same choice, had spent the past several days quietly pulling away instead. She thought about her 38-year-old self, deciding love simply was not coming for her anymore. She thought about every relationship that had ended because she let her career, or her fear, or her careful self-protection make the choice instead of her actual heart. She thought about a boy under an oak tree, holding out his hand, completely certain that 12-year-old promises could somehow still matter decades later. He had been right. Emma folded the paper one final time, slipped it into her coat pocket, and reached for her phone to check what time Daniel's flight was scheduled to leave in the morning. There was no time to lose. Emma arrived at the airport with her coat half buttoned and her heart pounding louder than the announcements echoing through the terminal. She had not called ahead. There had not been time. And some part of her suspected that if she gave Daniel any warning at all, careful, protective, Daniel might find a reason to talk her out of whatever she was about to do. She found his gate 12 minutes before final boarding, breathless, her hair pulled loose from the careful style she had worn to work that morning, looking nothing like the composed attorney her clients were used to seeing. Daniel was standing near the window, his boarding pass in hand, already turning toward the line beginning to form at the gate. "Daniel." He turned at the sound of her voice, visibly startled, his boarding pass nearly slipping from his fingers. "Emma, what are you doing here?" She did not answer right away. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the old folded paper, holding it out toward him the way he had once held it out to her in her office weeks earlier. He looked at the paper, then at her, clearly unsure what was happening. "I don't care where you're going," Emma said, her voice unsteady but certain. "I don't care if it's 3 years, or 5, or longer than that. I spent years waiting for the perfect moment to let myself want something like this again, and I'm done waiting." Daniel stared at her, the line behind him beginning to move forward without him. "I spent 28 years building a life that looked successful from the outside and felt empty most nights when I went home," she continued. "And then you walked into my office, holding a piece of paper 2 kids wrote because they were scared of growing old alone. I think they understood something we both forgot somewhere along the way." "Emma, I don't want to waste any more time," she said. "Whatever this is, wherever it takes us, I want to find out. I'm done letting fear make my decisions for me." For a long moment, Daniel said nothing at all. Then, slowly, the same smile she remembered from beneath an oak tree, 28 years earlier, spread across his face, deeper now, steadier, carrying every year that had passed between then and now. He reached for her hand, the boarding pass forgotten somewhere between his fingers. "I was hoping you'd say something exactly like that." Behind them, an airline employee called the final boarding announcement for his flight. Neither of them moved. Some promises, it turned out, were worth missing a flight for. What happened next was not nearly as dramatic as the airport reunion, although it required its own kind of courage from both of them. Daniel rebooked his flight for 2 weeks later. In that time, he and Emma made the kind of decisions adults make when they finally choose each other fully. The unglamorous, practical kind that rarely show up in the stories people tell about love. Emma negotiated a remote arrangement with her firm, something she had never once considered possible until she had an actual reason to ask for it. Daniel restructured his contract, trading 3 uninterrupted years abroad for a series of shorter postings that would allow him to return to Chicago between projects. It was not a perfect solution. Neither of them pretended it was. There would still be distance. There would still be difficult months, time zones to navigate, flights to coordinate around each other's demanding careers. But for the first time in either of their adult lives, they were facing that distance together instead of letting it quietly separate them the way fear once had. The old promise now lives framed on a shelf in their shared apartment, the paper finally protected behind glass after nearly 3 decades of being folded and unfolded, carried across cities and oceans, nearly lost more than once. It was never really a promise about marriage at all, not in the way 2 children once imagined it. It was a promise to keep choosing each other, long after it would have been easier not to. And sometimes, The people who almost let us go are simply waiting for us to finally show up. This is a work of fiction. All names, locations, events, and characters in this story are entirely invented for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.